My only reward for repairing that extraterrestrial craft was the truth. And the truth that being showed me about Jesus is not something you'll find in a Bible study or tucked behind a church pulpit. Forget doctrine. Forget the safe stories you heard in Sunday school. What I'm talking about is a connection that was buried, intentionally. A missing principle that snaps your entire existence into place. But hear me clearly, this knowledge comes with a cost. It illuminates corners of your life you didn't know were dark, and it casts new shadows over everything you thought was certain. If you're willing to confront what you were told could never be questioned, turn on notifications now. Because what Hank Lawson encountered in the desert outside Socorro, New Mexico wasn't the ending of a lonely life, it was the beginning of a revelation frozen in silence for 2,000 years. I fixed an alien ship, and what it revealed about Jesus will rewrite everything you think you know. This isn't religion. This is something hidden, deliberately. Something that, once you grasp it, will make your life line up in ways it never has before. But I need to warn you. What you're about to learn is unsettling. It will challenge everything you've been taught to trust. And once you see it, there's no going back. If you're ready for a truth churches never teach, subscribe and activate the bell. Because what happened to Hank Lawson inside that barn on a New Mexico ranch will open your eyes to something that has been concealed for 2,000 years. Now let me tell you how it started. The high desert does not rush for anyone. It sprawls around Hank Mercer in miles of scrub and dust, a horizon line smudged with distant mountains and radio towers. His double wide sits in the middle of it like an apology that never quite lands, aluminum skin faded, porch sagging, the paint on the trim chalked to the color of old bones. A rust-flecked Ford F-150 waits near the propane tank, hood still warm from yesterday's drive into town. Inside, the air carries the stale blend of motor oil, reheated dinners, and the faint echo of a life that used to feel busy. At 62, his body tells the story before his face does. The long white scar that arcs beneath his shirt, the pill bottles lined up by the sink, the way he grips the counter for an extra second before moving on. The heart surgery bought him time, but not certainty. Every climb up the porch steps is a negotiation, every ache in the chest a quiet question mark. The debt from that surgery sits just as heavily as the stent in his artery, numbers in the thousands, interest climbing in the background like a warning siren he tries not to hear. He moves through the trailer on practiced routes. Coffee first always. The Mr. Coffee machine coughs to life, pouring out dark, inexpensive strength into a chipped mug from some long-closed Ford dealership. A country station murmurs from a radio on the counter, steel guitars and familiar voices talking about heartbreak, God, and pickup trucks as if they were all the same kind of loss. The sound fills the silence without truly covering it, like wallpaper over cracked drywall. The land outside has its own biography stamped into it. Fence posts his father pounded in by hands still lean at odd angles along the property line. A windmill creaks faintly over a dry tank that only sees water during the rare generous rains. Old equipment sits half swallowed by dust and weeds. A busted tractor, a trailer with one tire gone, a rusted-out Chevy that never made it back onto the road. Each object is a sentence from another decade when the place felt like a promise instead of a countdown. Once, there was a path that seemed to lead away from all of this. In another version of his story, a younger Hank leaves New Mexico with an acceptance letter and a scholarship, learns equations instead of torque specs, and walks into NASA as an engineer instead of crawling under cars in a service bay. Community college textbooks still sit in a cardboard box under his bed, pages yellowed, margins full of notes. The chance slipped away when his father's health collapsed and somebody had to keep things running. In the desert, duty beats aspiration by default. That choice hardened into the shape of his whole life. Years of Air Force service as a mechanic followed, then a long stretch at the Ford dealer in Socorro, where he became the reliable guy who could listen to an engine for 3 seconds and name the problem. The work left his hands scarred and strong, his back stiff, his reputation solid. It also left him replaceable. When the dealership, optimized, and sleek diagnostic computers pushed out older hands, Hank's loyalty earned a handshake and a final paycheck, nothing more. The skills remained, the paycheck and health insurance did not. Now, the economy lives in his kitchen in the form of envelopes. They accumulate in a sloppy drift on the table. Hospital logos, county tax office seals, a credit card with a balance he pretends isn't there. Some are marked with urgent colors and capital letters, others with softer bureaucratic language that hides sharp teeth. He steps around them for days at a time, treating them like a stain he plans to scrub later. The numbers inside those envelopes represent real things. Gallons of gas he can't afford, pills he rations, work boots he can't replace. Outside the front window, the mailbox at the edge of the gravel driveway becomes a daily ritual and a quiet humiliation. Each afternoon he walks the 50 or so yards to the road, boots grinding on the loose stones, wind tugging at his shirt. The box creaks open to reveal the usual: circulars he never ordered, offers he can't accept, threats dressed up as statements. What does not appear is the thing he wants most: a handwritten envelope from his kids, a postcard, a scrap of paper with any proof that his bloodline remembers his zip code. The drive back to the house always feels longer than the walk down. The distance between him and his children stretches far beyond miles. One lives in a bigger city with glass buildings and a salary that buys sleek furniture and fast internet. The other buried his father under a pile of grudges and never bothered to dig him out. Phone calls have thinned into rare obligations, then into silence with occasional bursts of strained politeness on holidays. Their absence carves a canyon through the center of his routines, an ache that throbs whenever he passes the dusty photo frames still sitting on the entertainment center. The house itself mirrors his emotional state. The porch boards bow under his weight, paint flaking away in long curls. A kitchen cabinet door hangs permanently crooked. The bathroom mirror has a crack running through the corner that splits his reflection into two slightly misaligned versions of himself. Light bulbs in the hallway burn out and stay dark for weeks because replacing them would mean standing on a chair longer than his heart likes. Small repairs pile into a visible list of things he no longer has the energy or money to fix. Yet he refuses every suggestion, real or imagined, to walk away. Neighbors down the road sold out years ago, moved into town, or disappeared into retirement communities in other states. Hank stays. The soil holds his father's footprints, his own childhood, an entire marriage. Selling it feels like betraying a promise carved deeper than memory. Even as the county's language grows sharper, even as his body falters, he clings to this patch of harsh beauty with the stubbornness of a man who has lost too much already. Late afternoon light slants through grimy windows and turns the dust in the kitchen air into tiny drifting constellations. The radio plays another song about lost chances, barely audible over the hum of the refrigerator. Hank sits at the worn table with a plate scraped clean of a cheap frozen dinner, fork still in hand. The stack of envelopes sits exactly where he left it this morning, but today the weight of avoidance finally tips. His fingers reach out and pull the pile closer. He tears one open, then another. The language is polite, but the message is loud. Past due. Immediate attention required. Minimum payment. Remaining balance. The next envelope carries the county seal. That one he opens more slowly, as if gentler motions will soften the impact of the words inside. A single sheet lays out terms in precise legal phrasing that boils down to a simple truth: pay what is owed or the property leaves his name. His vision narrows on the date printed in bold near the bottom. A circle from a ballpoint pen he barely remembers using loops around it, a ring drawn in some earlier, more hopeful moment when the deadline still felt far away. Now, counting from this exact evening, that date is only 9 days out. A faint tightness grips the center of his chest, not yet a pain, more like a reminder from his own body that it has limits. He sits very still at the table, hand resting on the paper, eyes locked on that circled number. The bills form a rough wall around it, each envelope a brick in a structure closing in. Outside, the desert sun slides lower, throwing long shadows across the trailer and the tired truck in the yard. Inside, with the country radio murmuring about someone else's heartbreak, Hank counts the days without moving his lips and realizes that for the first time in his life, the land he thought would always be there for him has a clock ticking over it. Long before the medical bills and foreclosure notices, Hank's weeks were measured in Sundays. Every 7 days without fail, he drove into Socorro and turned toward a modest brick building with a white steeple and a sign out front that changed messages with the seasons. First Baptist was not grand, but it was dependable. Wooden pews creaked under familiar bodies. Hymn numbers went up on a board. The air held a blend of perfume, starch, and coffee from the fellowship hall. This rhythm formed the backbone of his inner life long before his outer one began to crumble. His Bible bore the marks of that devotion. The cover softened by decades of use, corners rounded, the leather darkened where his hands always held it. Inside, verses stood out in yellow and pink, lines underlined in pen, margin notes scribbled from sermons and late-night reading. Promises regarding provision, protection, and guidance glowed from the pages like neon in a dim alleyway. For years those words were not theory. They were the ground beneath his feet, the map he used to navigate a world that often did not make sense. When Linda was alive, faith felt like a shared project. Sunday mornings meant 2 coffee mugs on the counter instead of 1, a car ride with casual talk about the sermon, midweek potlucks, and the occasional small group where they added their voices to prayers for neighbors, missions, and illnesses. The rituals felt warm then, stitched into everyday joys and sorrows, a net beneath them both. Religion was not merely correct doctrine. It was the glow in the house during Christmas services, the casserole dishes that appeared when someone lost a loved one, the steady hum of belonging. Her sudden stroke tore that net without warning. One ordinary night she breathed beside him as always, and by morning the bed held only absence. The hospital's fluorescent lights and rapid jargon did not leave much room for theology. Later, when papers were signed and condolences offered, Hank returned to a bedroom that felt like a museum exhibit and a life split into before and after. Grief in that form does not find easy expression, especially in men trained to keep their hands busy and their feelings buried. Out of that raw emptiness, a new ritual forged itself. Every night at 9 o'clock the television volume dropped, and the recliner lost its occupant. Hank took the same path down the short hallway, past the same framed pictures, and lowered himself into the same chair near the window. The Bible opened to familiar psalms or the teachings of Jesus. Words about comfort, deliverance, and answered cries filled the space. Eyes closed, he pushed through the ache in his throat and formed requests for strength, for some trace of guidance, for help carrying losses that felt too heavy for one person. What began as a lifeline became a discipline. The clock's digital numbers rolled to 9 p.m. and he responded like muscle memory. When bills began to stack higher, those sessions stretched longer. He asked for clarity about money, for direction on where to seek work, for doors to open that remained stubbornly shut. As his health faltered and hospital visits increased, those appeals shifted toward healing, toward the hope that the same God who, according to the sermons, parted seas and raised the dead might stabilize a failing heart in New Mexico. Meanwhile, parts of his life moved in the opposite direction of those petitions. A son began to avoid phone calls, then abandoned visits altogether. A daughter pursued a life in a distant city that required flight connections to reach instead of a drive down the highway. The job that had seemed secure evaporated in a haze of corporate restructuring and new technology he never got time to learn. Each change arrived without warning, indifferent to whatever prayer had gone up the night before. In response, Hank did not immediately withdraw. At first he pushed deeper into the practices he knew. He attended more services, even midweek ones. He tuned into Christian radio during long drives, absorbing promises, testimonies, and teachings about sowing and reaping, about breakthrough just around the corner. Televised sermons flickered in the living room, preachers standing on grand stages far from Socorro speaking confidently about favor and destiny. He compared their language with his reality and waited for the two to intersect. The waiting stretched into years. The nightly sessions continued. Some nights the words poured out rapidly, a stream of requests and gratitude and confession. Other nights they came slower, shaped more by habit than by emotion, syllables falling into the same patterns they had for months. There were evenings when he felt a brief flicker of warmth, a sense of being heard. There were many more when the room seemed as unresponsive as the desert outside, the air around him unchanged by whatever left his lungs. Somewhere along the way, small anomalies began to slip into his awareness. The digital clock on the microwave flashed 3:33 when he walked past in the dark to get a glass of water. A receipt at the gas station printed a total of $33.33. A mileage gauge on his truck rolled into a string of threes just as a worship song mentioned angels. Each occurrence was odd enough to notice, not dramatic enough to demand attention. He registered them, shrugged, and moved on. Life already held bigger problems. Nevertheless, those repeating numbers persisted like a faint tap on a window he refused to open. Every now and then, one aligned with a particularly discouraging day, arriving exactly when he felt most unseen. Still, he never allowed the pattern to become more than coincidence. To connect it with anything beyond randomness would require believing in a level of intentionality that his circumstances did not support. It felt safer to consider it a glitch in his perception rather than a message no one had cared to clarify. Gradually, the pew at First Baptist grew colder. He still attended for a while, sliding into his usual spot, adding his voice to hymns he knew by heart. But the sermons that once felt like food began to sound like recorded messages designed for some other audience. Promises of reward for steady faith bumped against the stubborn reality of his unpaid bills and unanswered questions. Each Sunday he came home a little more hollow. Eventually, one weekend arrived when he simply did not go. No emergency prevented it. No dramatic crisis occurred. He just stayed home and nothing visibly shifted as a result. That quiet lack of consequence made the next absence easier. The nightly ritual remained longer than Sunday mornings. It became a private anchor, separated from the church community that once reinforced it. Even as attendance slipped, 9 o'clock still drew him to the chair. The words no longer flowed with the same confidence, but the posture stayed. Bible open. Hands folded or resting on his knees. A mind reaching toward a presence he had been taught never left. This went on until the strain between promise and experience finally exceeded his ability to bridge it. On one particular evening, the weight of everything accumulated pressed down harder than usual. The day had brought more bad news in the mail, more physical exhaustion, more evidence that nothing external was bending in his favor. The pages in front of him blurred. The verses that once seemed alive read like lines in a contract no one intended to honor. Instead of comfort, they produced a dull ache in his chest and an uncomfortable sense of having been naive. He closed the book slowly, the sound of pages and cover meeting louder than the small motion warranted. He did not make a speech or stage a dramatic gesture. The decision not to reach out again settled wordlessly into the room, a heavy, invisible object that changed its shape. The chair by the window, once a place of attempted connection, felt more like a museum display of wasted effort. The Bible, now resting beside a framed photograph from happier years, took on the weight of an artifact rather than a conduit. Silence settled around him, not peaceful but dense, as if the air itself had chosen not to respond. Sleep came that night like a blackout. No long wrestling. No extended reflection. Fatigue of body and soul simply overpowered him. Hours passed unnoticed, the desert wind brushing against the trailer's thin walls, distant traffic humming along the state route, stars burning silently over the county. Inside the dark bedroom, the only light came from a small digital clock on the nightstand casting a greenish glow onto the wall. Sometime deep in those hours, without any dream to mark the transition, Hank's eyes snapped open. No sound preceded it. No thunder, no knocking, no voice. His body reacted before his mind did, heartbeat suddenly loud in his ears, lungs pulling in air as if he had been underwater. The room around him appeared exactly as it had when he drifted off. Same furniture, same folded clothes on the chair, same shadowed ceiling. The one difference was the clock. Its rectangular face carved a harsh patch of green into the dark. 3 numbers, identical, stood in a row. The colon between them blinked steadily as if marking each passing second. 3:33 in the morning. The display seemed brighter than it should, almost intrusive, like an eye that refused to close. A familiar unease crept over his skin, a subtle prickle at the base of his neck and along his forearms, the sensation of being observed from just beyond sight. The air felt a fraction cooler, as though something had shifted the balance without stirring the curtains. Logic assembled quickly to smother the rising instinct. Adrenaline from stress. Poor sleep. A lifetime of sermons about spiritual warfare melting into a vague sense of threat with no clear source. He stared at the numbers until the colon blinked again, marking another second gone. The sensation of being noticed did not fade, but he pushed against it with the only tools he had left: rational explanations and stubborn refusal. His mind framed the feeling as nerves, as the aftershock of abandoning a ritual that had structured a decade of nights. The conclusion that nothing stood in the room with him except old furniture and a man who had finally run out of words became a shield he chose to hold, even as something unseen settled its gaze more firmly upon him. Late August in Socorro County carries a special kind of tension, air that feels dry and swollen at the same time, clouds piling high over the Magdalena Mountains like dark towers waiting for a signal. Hank felt the shift long before the first rumble, the kind of subtle pressure drop old mechanics get used to predicting through their bones rather than barometers. The evening had started normally enough. A microwave dinner cooling on the tray table, a worn recliner tilted back just far enough to ease his chest, and an old Cowboys game replaying on the TV with the sound low. The glow from the screen washed the room in flickering blues, catching the edges of dusty picture frames and the sagging curtains that never fully kept out the desert heat. Outside, the wind rose in steady pulses, pushing sand across the driveway and rattling the loose gutter Hank kept meaning to fix. Distant thunder cracked without rhythm, like something massive shifting its weight across the sky. The monsoon season always brought spectacle, but tonight felt different. More charged, more deliberate, as if a boundary were thinning between the familiar and something far more dangerous. Even the livestock 2 miles down the highway went quiet, their usual night sounds drowned by a deepening pressure in the air. Lightning began to pulse behind the mountains, long silent flashes that made the window panes tremble. Shadows from the family photos stuttered in a way that didn't match the timing of the storm, splitting and reforming on the cheap wood paneling. Hank watched them with a growing tightness in his chest, that faint pressure the doctor always told him to track. The storm wasn't overhead yet, but the scent of charged air, metallic and bitter, crept through the cracks of the double-wide, slithering across the living room like something alive. By the time the first raindrops hit the roof, the sky had turned an unnatural shade of violet. Thunder detonated without warning, shaking the walls, followed by a flash so bright it bleached every color from the room. The cross above the TV trembled once, then again, tapping softly against the wall with a rhythm that didn't belong to wind or vibration. Hank leaned forward, remote forgotten in his hand, eyes locked on that small wooden shape his wife once hung during a better season of life. He had seen storms knock over porch furniture, shred tarps, and send tumbleweeds crashing into fence posts, but never had one reached inside his home. Then the vibration began. It didn't start with a sound. It arrived inside his ribcage, a low hum that resonated through bone and muscle as though someone had placed a tuning fork against his spine. The recliner quivered beneath him. The water glass on the end table formed concentric rings that widened and vanished in perfect patterns. The floor vibrated with a frequency too steady for thunder, too precise for machinery, and too sustained for anything he'd ever known. This wasn't nature's chaos. This was something calibrated. The light came next. Wrong light, impossible light, saturating the double-wide in a blue-white glow that didn't flicker or flash. It seeped under the door, through the thin seams of the windows, and across the carpet in a wide, steady wash, as though the desert outside had been replaced by some radiant alien field. Shadows bent in directions they never should have. The shape of the recliner cast two silhouettes, one reaching forward while the other leaned back, neither aligning with the light source. Hank felt his heartbeat trip, then race, the tightness in his chest blooming into something like panic edged with awe. His first instinct was to explain it away. Transformer blowouts, military aircraft, maybe even ball lightning, anything more acceptable than the thought that something intelligent had arrived. But the illusions fell apart under the weight of the moment. No transformer made a sound that resonated through teeth. No aircraft produced light that poured in from all directions at once. No ball lightning ever held steady, filling a home with a glow so clean it made the dust motes look like frozen stars. The wooden cross knocked harder now, tapping like faint knuckles on a door. The photos on the opposite wall buzzed in their frames. The TV flickered into static, then into a field of pure white before the screen went black, leaving Hank alone in the electric silence that pressed around him like a physical force. The vibration climbed higher, humming along the metal frame of the trailer until every screw seemed to sing. Even the air felt different, dense, almost liquid, as if gravity were rearranging itself. Hank tried to stand, but the sensation pinned him in place. Every muscle felt both weightless and heavy. His breath came in shallow pulls. He sensed, not thought but sensed, that something was moving outside, crossing the desert floor with purpose, something that carried the storm with it in a way storms were not meant to be carried. He wanted to go to the window to see what shape moved beneath the violent sky, but some deeper instinct kept him frozen. The same instinct that stops a man from stepping too close to a rattlesnake he knows is coiled in the brush. A final pulse of light surged through the living room, brighter than every flash before it, so bright it erased the edges of reality for a split second. The vibration reached its peak, a frequency that made the fillings in his teeth ache. Then, without fading, without warning, it stopped. The light vanished. The vibration died. The storm outside continued, but inside the trailer the world fell into a stillness so absolute it felt manufactured. The silence pressed in, thick and total. No hum from the refrigerator. No static from the TV. No rattle of the wind against the windows. Only Hank's ragged breathing filled the void. It took him several long seconds to realize he'd been holding it, and when he finally exhaled, the sound seemed too loud, as if the air itself was listening. He sat in that unnatural calm, afraid to move, afraid to speak, afraid even to wonder what had come and gone, because if he acknowledged the thought taking shape in the silence, he'd have to decide which name to give it: God, the devil, or something far more unsettling than either. Morning broke with the kind of deceptive beauty only the desert can manage. Sky washed a brilliant blue, sun lifting cleanly over the horizon. The storm's chaos erased as though the night had folded itself into a dream. The double-wide looked the same as always, its aluminum siding reflecting pale light. The windmill creaked its usual greeting. Nothing outward hinted at the impossible glow that had filled the place hours earlier. Hank stepped out onto the porch with a mug of coffee, letting the coolness of dawn steady him, half convinced the night had been a trick of exhaustion or some cardiac misfire his doctor had forgotten to warn him about. But the desert never lies, not really. It simply waits for a man to step off the porch and pay attention. As Hank scanned the property, something tugged at the edge of his vision. a patch of darker soil far out beyond the windmill, a stain where no shadow should be. It sat on the back acreage, land he jokingly called the back 40, though it barely measured 8 acres. From this distance, the patch looked like a bruise on the earth's surface, sunken slightly, its shape too symmetrical to be natural. The mug grew heavier in his hand. Storms leave debris, not perfect geometry. Curiosity pulled him forward with a force he couldn't resist. Each step across the property carried the memory of last night's unnatural silence. The desert air warmed quickly under the climbing sun, brushing against his skin with a dry heat that felt almost normal. But the normality fell away with every yard he closed between himself and the strange patch. The edges sharpened. The color deepened. And soon there was no mistaking that something had marked his land, deliberately. Standing at the edge of the anomaly, Hank felt his stomach drop. The circle stretched about 30 feet across, etched into the desert floor with an exactness no weather pattern could produce. The ground inside it wasn't merely burned or scorched, it was fused. The sand and dirt had melted into a thin sheet of glass, smooth in some areas, rippled in others as if pressed by unimaginable heat and then cooled too quickly. When he crouched and laid his fingertips on the surface, he jerked back in shock. It was warm. Hours after sunrise and a full night's cooling, it remained warm. Around the outer edge, desert plants bent outward as if shoved aside by a wave of force. They weren't singed or torn. They were repositioned, neatly, uniformly, each one angled away from the circle's center. No equipment he knew could do that without leaving tracks. And the storm certainly hadn't paused mid-violence to sculpt the desert floor. He felt a strange pulse of fear in his throat, dry and breathless, the kind that precedes either revelation or regret. As he stepped closer to the middle, the glassy surface crunched under his boots, brittle flakes breaking away with each motion. The ground dipped into a shallow impression, maybe a foot deep, suggesting something heavy had rested there. Heavy enough to compress the earth but not leave debris. That absence of debris chilled him more than the heat of the glass. Only manufactured things leave nothing behind. Natural things always shed. Then he saw it, subtle, almost invisible until the light hit just right. A set of digits embedded in the glass itself, faint but unmistakable. 333. The breath froze in his lungs. His first instinct was denial. Maybe the cracks formed a pattern coincidentally. Maybe the desert floor played tricks on the eyes under direct sun. But when he knelt and leaned in, the truth sharpened into razor clarity. The numbers were not cracks. They were stamped, burnt, pressed into the substance of the earth with deliberate precision. 333. The same sequence that haunted his microwave clock. His receipts. His mileage gauge. The time he always seemed to wake when nightmares chased him awake. A number he had dismissed for years as coincidence or superstition. Something harmless, meaningless. Seeing it carved into the desert floor forced a new, unwelcome possibility. Maybe something had been trying to get his attention long before last night. And maybe he had chosen not to see it. The space around him felt suddenly larger. Too open. Too exposed. The sun, bright only moments ago, seemed harsher now, flattening the land with a merciless glare. Hank rose slowly, aware of his pulse ticking too fast. He rubbed his palms on his jeans as if trying to wipe off a feeling he didn't have language for. The idea of calling the sheriff flickered through his mind, followed immediately by the image of uniformed men roping off his property, asking questions with raised eyebrows, filing reports that labeled him unstable. Telling the pastor crossed his mind next. Pastor Dale with his gentle voice and predictable sermons. But how does a man even begin to explain something like this without sounding touched? Pastor, the storm wrote numbers in my dirt. It sounded like the kind of confession that earns a prayer circle and a whispered rumor mill. The third option, the quietest, most tempting, was to tell no one. To pretend the circle didn't exist. To walk back to the porch, pour another coffee, and convince himself that the storm simply struck the ground in an unusual way. But the problem stood there, etched beneath his boots. Choosing ignorance wouldn't erase what he'd seen. A faint sound broke the desert's brittle stillness. Hank straightened, turning toward the barn. It wasn't wind. It wasn't an animal. It was wet. Ragged. Human but not quite. A struggling cough, loose and painful, echoing from within the shadows of his pole barn. The circle behind him felt suddenly colder. The land around him felt smaller. And whatever lay inside that barn was no longer just an idea. It was breathing. The barn felt colder than the desert morning should allow, as though the structure itself held its breath. Hank stepped inside with the hesitance of someone crossing into forbidden ground, boots grinding against the concrete floor. Dust hung thick in the air, particles suspended rather than drifting, as if the storm outside had seeped into this space and refused to settle. The familiar silhouettes of tools, engine blocks, and old workbenches loomed in their usual places, but they felt rearranged by fear alone. Nothing had physically shifted, yet everything inside the barn felt like a stage set around an unseen center. That center revealed itself in the far corner. A shape, slumped and too long in all the wrong ways, crouched where the shadows refused to lift. Hank's first thought was a man, someone injured, someone trespassing, but the proportions dissolved that idea before it fully formed. The limbs were elongated, jointed oddly, the torso narrower than any human frame should be. Ashen blue skin caught the soft daylight through gaps in the metal siding, and in that thin illumination faint lines shimmered beneath the skin like circuitry or veins built from light. These lines pulsed weakly, echoing a rhythm that felt both biological and engineered. Its clothing, or what passed for it, seemed molded rather than worn. A single piece of shifting material clung to the being's body, wavering between dull silver and muted earth tones with every shallow breath it took. The fabric looked alive, adjusting, calibrating, failing. Hank froze. His mind, trained to fix engines but never mysteries of this scale, scrambled for explanation, but no tool he had was meant for this. Then the eyes opened. They didn't snap or flutter awake, they unfurled. Dark, impossibly deep, almost human yet not, they held a depth that suggested oceans of memory. There was no malice in them, no threat, only exhaustion. Exhaustion so profound it felt ancient, as though the being was wrestling with the last threads of its existence. When its gaze met Hank's, something sharp pierced the center of his mind. Not pain, connection. Images detonated behind his eyes. Dry riverbeds cracked open beneath a brutal sun. A body, this body, curled in a shallow crater, skin splintered, breath rattling, reaching for water that wasn't there. That image dissolved into another. A younger Hank kneeling at a wooden altar inside First Baptist, his head bowed, fingers trembling as he prayed into the void he hoped was filled. Prayer after prayer stacked upon each other like pages in a book the world had never read. The visions crashed so fast he staggered, grasping at the workbench for balance. Something in those images wasn't spoken, it was lived. Whatever this thing was, it hadn't only watched him, it had felt him. The being's chest rose with effort, drawing in air that sounded foreign in its lungs. A dry crackle followed with each exhale, the sound of something breaking quietly inside. Hank didn't need words. His body, shaped by decades of sermons and Southern Baptist reflexes, moved before thought. A command older than reason guided him. If someone needs water, you give it. Not because it's noble, because it's right. He crossed the barn, legs shaking, to the old sink in the corner. The faucet sputtered before yielding a thin stream of clear water. Hank grabbed the first cup he saw, a faded plastic one with Ford trucks stamped in red across the side. He filled it until the water trembled at the rim. The moment felt absurd, surreal, wholly horrifying. A widowed mechanic offering tap water to something that shouldn't exist. Yet the simplicity of the act grounded him. This was what he knew how to do. Fix what he could, comfort what he could reach, steady what was falling. He returned to the being, heart pounding so hard it echoed in his jaw. It watched him, eyes flickering with a faint inner light, as though tracking not just his movement but his intention. Hank lowered himself onto one knee, his joints crackling loudly in the silence, and extended the cup. The being lifted its hand. For long fingers reached out, trembling, the skin warmer than he expected. When those fingers brushed his, a jolt shot up Hank's arm, not electrical but emotional. Another flood of images burst through him. His father teaching him to turn a wrench for the first time, Linda laughing under Christmas lights, the moment in the hospital when the heart monitor steadied after the surgery, the empty house afterward when that steadiness no longer mattered. The visions weren't random. They were curated. Each memory was one he had tried not to revisit. The being guided the cup to its mouth with fragile care. Its lips sealed around the rim. Water poured down its throat with trembling sips. The sound was soft yet resonant enough to fill the entire barn. Hank watched each swallow like a man watching his last match catch fire in the dark. As the being drank, its skin brightened. Not much, not dramatically, but enough to suggest the water carried meaning beyond hydration. The faint lines beneath its skin pulsed faster, sinking with a rhythm Hank felt in his pulse. When the cup emptied, the being lowered it slowly. Its hand rested on Hank's for one lingering moment. That touch carried no threat, yet a tremor ran through Hank's entire body. It wasn't fear. It was recognition. A sense of being seen. Not in the way a pastor promises God sees his flock. In the way a witness sees the truth of someone, stripped of disguise, stripped of bravado, stripped of lies. Hank felt the weight of every unanswered prayer hanging in the space between them, years of pleading, hours of silence, a decade of believing no one had listened. The barn seemed to sharpen around them. The smell of old oil thickened. Dust motes hung suspended in beams of pale morning light. Somewhere outside, a desert bird cried out once, sharp and distant. The being's eyes deepened, focusing on him with a clarity that broke something open inside his chest. Then the presence in his mind shifted. What was fragmented became coherent. The thoughts crystallized, shaping into something unmistakable. A voice, not heard but understood, emerged from within the connection now forged between them. It addressed him, not as man, not as human, but by his name. It carried the tone of someone who had watched him for far longer than last night, someone who had seen every 9 p.m. ritual, every whispered request, every moment he thought he was alone. The final sensation before the connection deepened was simple and devastating. It had heard him, when even heaven had stayed silent. And as the being gathered strength to speak again, its thoughts unfurled with one unshakable implication. His prayers had never been lost, they had been observed. And the observer was sitting injured in his barn. The next thought forming in the being's mind was clearer, heavier, aimed directly at him, and Hank's breath caught as the first words sharpened toward meaning. The barn no longer felt like a structure built from metal and bolts. It had become a threshold, thin, permeable, as if one step forward would place Hank not in his own life but inside something vast and ancient. The being, strengthened slightly by the water, lifted its head. The patterns beneath its skin pulsed in slow, deliberate cascades, syncing with a rhythm older than any heartbeat Hank had ever known. Then the visions began. Not images this time, worlds. Entire centuries unfurled in sweeping arcs across Hank's consciousness, each one sharp as desert sunlight. The barn dissolved, replaced by a place of sand and stone, where narrow streets wound through ancient Jerusalem. Crowds pressed in along dusty pathways, their voices swelling like a tide as a man walked among them. A man whose presence made the air shimmer with a quiet authority more potent than any miracle. Hank felt the weight of that presence, not as a story retold but as an event happening in real time. The being did not narrate the scenes. It allowed them to unfold naturally, each detail arranged with the precision of memory rather than imagination. Hank sensed the watchers, not human, positioned beyond the edges of the gathered crowds. They observed with purpose. Not worship. Not skepticism. Study. Their attention did not fix on the man's physical form but on the field around him. A field alive with intention that altered matter, adjusted probability, bent reality gently without force. Hank saw Jesus heal, not through spectacle but through a law. A law he understood intimately, enacted effortlessly, lived instinctively. A law woven into the fabric of existence, visible to those capable of perceiving its mechanics. Each miracle pulsed with geometric precision, as if invisible equations danced through the space between gesture and outcome. Then came another scene, darker. A hill outside the city, sky heavy and bruised with grief. The watchers were present here too, their forms faint, their attention fixed not on suffering but on the strange stillness that followed. Hank felt the fabric of reality tighten, then release, like breath drawn in and exhaled across the universe. The watchers recorded it, not with tools but with perception attuned to cosmic shifts. The visions shifted again. Stone walls, dim lamplight, small groups of early believers whispering in secret gatherings. The air thick with both fear and wonder. Hank could sense the watchers moving among them unseen, studying the young movement like scientists observing a delicate combustion. Faith igniting in confined spaces, fragile yet powerful. They watched these gatherings as some humans might study stars, charting patterns, tracking anomalies, seeking meaning. Time accelerated in a blur of centuries. Churches rising, empires falling, councils convening in candlelit rooms to decide which teachings survived and which vanished. Hank felt the watchers' attention narrow, their interest in human interpretation thinning as doctrine hardened into structures that obscured the original law they had witnessed firsthand. Then the visions leapt across the ocean. Revival tents in the American South, canvas flapping under humid night air as crowds gathered in fervent expectation. Preachers wiped sweat from their brows under lantern light, their voices booming, their words heavy with promise. The watchers were there too, hovering at the edge of the tents, perceiving a strange mixture. Genuine yearning tangled with cultural spectacle. The law Jesus lived flickered faintly in some hearts but dimmed under repetition, performance and misunderstanding. Next came megachurches. Vast sanctuaries bathed in LED light, stages lined with screens, hundreds lifting hands while fog machines hissed in the background. Hank felt the watcher's quiet assessment, potent emotion, sincere desperation, and yet, misalignment. The original principle, the law beneath the words, no longer guided the practice. Human amplification had drowned the frequency. All of it passed through Hank in a torrent that struck at his deepest assumptions. He had spent decades believing he simply lacked the right faith, the right discipline, the right way of asking. But the visions painted a different picture. The law had not been hidden by God. It had been buried by men, layered under centuries of doctrine, politics, fear, and translation. The watchers had studied all of it. Not to interfere. Not to convert. But because consciousness itself was their field, and Jesus, the man Hank had prayed to every night at 9, had demonstrated mastery of the law like no other figure in human history. He was not merely a teacher. He was a phenomenon they had charted for over 2 millennia. The vision slowed. The barn returned. The being's gaze fixed on Hank with renewed clarity. Its presence in his mind sharpened, no longer fragmented by weakness. Thoughts formed with precision, carrying the weight of truth delivered without gentleness. It did not reprimand. It did not soothe. It simply revealed. The final thought pressed into Hank's mind was a blade disguised as mercy, a truth that cut but freed in the same motion. Jesus had never asked for endless repetition. He had asked for alignment. Alignment with a law so few had ever been taught, a law the watchers had observed being wielded flawlessly but rarely replicated. Hank felt the implication strike with stunning force. His unanswered prayers weren't signs of divine neglect. They were evidence of a broken system, one that taught hearts to cry out without teaching minds to align with the framework behind the cry. The being's closing thoughts surged forward, crisp and impossible to ignore, tightening around Hank's consciousness with the weight of 2,000 years of observation. Something fundamental about prayer, faith, and Jesus himself had been misunderstood, and the watchers were prepared to show him what had been missing all along. Morning settled over the barn with a strangely purposeful stillness, as if the desert itself were holding back its breath to see what Hank would do next. Sunlight slipped through gaps in the siding, casting narrow bands of gold across the concrete floor. Every beam revealed dust suspended in frozen motion, as though time had thickened rather than passed. Hank wiped his palms against his jeans, grounding himself in the familiar texture of worn denim. The previous day's revelation still stirred under his ribs, but today brought demands more tangible than visions: tools, machinery, and the raw instinct of a mechanic who'd spent a lifetime fixing broken things he understood. He cleared a wide space in the barn, dragging old engine blocks to the edges, pushing aside years of half-finished projects that had gathered cobwebs and resignation. His DeWalt drill, socket set, and multimeter lay where they always did, ready for use, their yellow casing streaked with oil from 100 different repairs. These tools were his language, the only vocabulary he trusted. If he could speak through them, maybe he could understand the impossible craft resting in front of him like a fallen star shaped into metal and bone. Up close, the ship defied every principle he'd learned at the Ford plant or in the Air Force motor pool. Its surface wasn't cold steel or composite. It felt warm, pliable, alive under his fingers. When he pressed lightly against a seam, the material responded by subtly shifting, as if assessing the pressure. The craft seemed to breathe in slow, shallow intervals. Organic but not alive. Engineered but not mechanical. It inhabited the space between those definitions, and Hank felt the edges of his understanding stretch painfully wide. The being watched from the far side of the barn, propped against a crate, its energy returning in slow pulses. Each flicker of light beneath its skin matched rhythmic patterns Hank couldn't decipher. When Hank set his hand on a melted conduit near the ship's underside, the creature's thoughts brushed lightly against his awareness. Guidance without instruction, direction without words. It showed him which networks were vital, which pathways were compromised, and which components required more than tools. The more he worked, the more the ship responded. Panels unfurled like petals, exposing inner layers that pulsed faintly with color. Fibrous wiring retracted and expanded like muscle tissue. Hank modified his approach instinctively, using not just his hands but intention, steady breath, focused attention, a clarity he'd never associated with repair work. The craft reacted to the quality of his presence, its system stabilizing when his focus held firm and destabilizing when doubt crept in. That was when the being began its quiet instruction. Not spoken, not taught, revealed. A sensation pressed into Hank's mind, warm and steady, peeling back the desperation in his old prayers like layers of cracked paint. It showed him each time he'd pleaded into the darkness while bracing for disappointment. Each night he'd collapsed into the ritual not with belief but with fear. Fear of loss, fear of scarcity, fear of silence. His prayers had been contradictions, half rooted in trust, half in doubt. And the law beneath the words, the principle Jesus demonstrated, required alignment, not begging. Coherence, not panic. Hank's heart pounded hard enough to shake him. Decades of devotion reframed in minutes. Every unanswered petition took on a different meaning. His chest tightened, not with pain but with the overwhelming weight of realization. He had spent years praying from a place of, please don't abandon me. And the law didn't answer fear. It reflected it, echoed it, multiplied it. The being continued the lesson through demonstration. It directed Hank's attention to a small part he needed, an odd-sized fastener he knew he didn't own. Without it, the repair stalled. His instinct was to curse under his breath and plan a trip into town. But before frustration took hold, an impression nudged his thoughts. Loosen your grip on the outcome. Breathe. Align. He didn't understand how to do that, not really. But he tried. He steadied his breath, cleared his mind, set the intention that the part would appear, not through magic but through alignment. He felt foolish, childish even. Yet something shifted in the air around him, a subtle recalibration he couldn't explain. Minutes later, as he reorganized a drawer in search of alternatives, his fingers brushed a small cardboard box he didn't remember placing there. Inside lay the exact fastener he'd needed. No. Unopened. Tagged with a hardware store sticker showing a sale price Hank didn't recall paying. The receipt crumpled at the bottom bore a timestamp. 3:33. His stomach dropped. His pulse stuttered. The air thickened. He tried to rationalize. Misplaced inventory, memory lapse, coincidence. But the being's silent presence made denial feel brittle, thin, laughable. The tiny number on the receipt glowed in the barn's dim light like a branded signature. An imprint of a law he never knew existed. A whisper of reality itself bending to intention instead of fear. He clutched the box, hands trembling. The first crack in his certainty widened, letting in a sliver of dangerous hope. The part lay in his palm like proof he wasn't ready to accept. And as he stared down at it, the being's thoughts gathered like a gathering storm, preparing to unfold a truth that would break open the rest of his world. The micro-manifestation wasn't the end. It was the invitation. The next revelation waited just beyond the edge of this trembling moment. By the second morning, the barn felt less like a workspace and more like an intersection between realities. Hank's tools lay scattered across the concrete in ordered chaos. Conduit strippers, insulated pliers, a voltmeter blinking uselessly beside alien components it could barely register. The ship hummed faintly now, its systems waking sluggishly under Hank's steady repairs. Melted conduits had been rerouted. Damaged pathways were pulsing with restored energy. The being's presence felt stronger too, though still anchored by exhaustion. As Hank rewired a damaged power node, its interior textures shifting like woven light, the air changed. Temperature dropped. Sound thinned. The barn dissolved in a dim shimmer, not disappearing but becoming translucent, like a veil pulled aside. Something vast pressed against the edges of his awareness, then split open into a stream of living memory. The visions didn't transport him fully, they layered themselves over the present, time becoming a double exposure. The barn remained, but woven through it came scenes so vivid he felt dust and sunlight from another era brush against his skin. He found himself standing at the edge of a crowd in first-century Galilee, watching Jesus teach near a cluster of olive trees. The man's presence radiated intention, sharp, precise, unwavering. His words carried the cadence of someone describing the deepest physics of existence, not offering religious comfort. Each teaching layered meaning upon meaning, forming principles Hank could feel but not yet articulate. The watchers, the being's own kind, observed from the outskirts, mapping the patterns in Jesus' voice, the shifts in consciousness among the listeners, the subtle alignment of emotion and reality. Another layer formed, a storm thrashing a small boat on dark water. Jesus stood calm while the others panicked. He lifted his hand, not as command but as calibration, aligning himself with a principle the watchers had studied for ages. The wind collapsed. The water stilled. Everything bent to coherence. Hank felt the law in that moment, humming with the same energy he sensed in the ship, an equation disguised as peace. Visions shifted again, darker now. Ancient councils convened in smoke-filled rooms. Men argued over doctrine, what to include, what to bury, what would unify empires or cement influence. Hank saw entire teachings edited down, core principles reframed for control rather than comprehension. Passages removed, meanings inverted, warnings softened or sharpened to serve agendas that had nothing to do with the law Jesus embodied. The watchers stood unseen, absorbing every political distortion with an ancient patience that bordered on sorrow. Next came scenes of monks preserving fragments of earlier texts, scrolls that pulsed with clarity, lines that captured the law in its raw form. These fragments were hidden, protected, sometimes burned, sometimes copied in secret. Human hands fought wars over interpretations without ever grasping the principle beneath them. The visions leapt to America, revivals under canvas tents in the early 1900s. Hank sensed power in those gatherings but also desperation. People begged for miracles without understanding the alignment that produced them. Their faith was sincere but miscalibrated. Then megachurches filled the frame, screens, fog machines, booming sermons built on spectacle. The watchers hovered here too, measuring sincerity against distortion. The core truth flickered weakly beneath performance, buried under layers of entertainment and repetition. Hank felt each scene strike deeper than the last. A slow, seismic unraveling began inside him. His life at First Baptist, every winter morning he knelt at the altar, every prayer whispered beside Linda's hospital bed, they all carried echoes of form without function. He had followed rituals built on edited versions of teachings that once carried pure coherence. His faith hadn't been rejected. It had been misdirected. He set down his wire cutters with shaking hands and sank onto an old shop stool. Tears blurred the ship into halos of blue light. Grief hit him in waves, not grief for God, but for the years he spent believing he was unworthy because heaven stayed silent. The truth landed with brutal clarity. The silence wasn't divine. It was systemic, human-made, historically engineered. The being approached him slowly, its presence a calm counterweight to the storm inside his chest. Its thoughts pressed gently against his mind. What he had seen so far was only the beginning. Understanding the full law would require peeling away every identity he'd built, churchgoer, penitent, sinner, believer. He would have to shed the man he had been shaped into. The warning came not as threat but truth. Seeing the mechanics of Jesus' actions would demand the death of Hank's old self. The cost of clarity stood in front of him now, vast and unavoidable. And the next layer of revelation waited just beyond the trembling breath he drew in, poised to reshape everything he believed about prayer, power, and the God he thought had abandoned him. By mid-morning, the desert sun had burned away the last trace of cool air, leaving the land flat and exposed beneath a white-hot sky. Hank stepped out of the barn to stretch his back, wiping sweat from his brow with the corner of his shirt. He had barely taken 2 steps toward the porch when the mailbox flag caught his eye, raised, bright red against the pale horizon. The sight froze him mid-stride. He hadn't raised it. He hadn't sent anything. But the mail carrier had been by. The dread that followed felt mechanical, automatic, a reflex honed by months of bad news delivered in white envelopes. He opened the box. A single letter sat inside, stamped with the county seal. Not the friendly one used for tax reminders, the other one, the one used for final notices. The kind that closed conversations rather than invited them. His fingers trembled as he tore it open. The paper inside was heavy, official. The words were short, uncompromising. The auction date was confirmed. 9 days. No extensions. No leniency. No miracle exceptions. If he failed to pay the full amount, including penalties, the land would be seized and sold to the highest bidder. He stood at the end of his gravel driveway staring at the desert expanse, the letter fluttering in the breeze like a white flag of surrender. The thought of losing the land, his father's land, the only thing that still tethered him to the world, knocked the breath out of him. Every memory tied to these acres, birthdays, building projects, Christmas mornings, Linda's laughter carried on the wind, was suddenly held hostage by a number on a page. He folded the letter slowly, slipping it into his back pocket as though hiding it might delay its truth. The barn waited behind him. The being inside waited too, patient, ancient. But the outside world was beginning to stir in ways far more familiar and far more terrifying. A low rumble cut across the sky. Hank glanced upward. A twin-engine aircraft, small and dark, flew lower than typical traffic over Socorro County. Too low for sightseeing. Too steady for a storm surveyor. The plane circled once, banking sharply, then circled again. The angle of its path intersected the space above Hank's property with suspicious precision. He followed its arc until it disappeared behind distant hills, his heart stuttering in a way that had nothing to do with surgery scars. Aircraft didn't just circle out here. Not unless they were lost, or looking for something. He suddenly felt exposed, standing out in the open with the memory of a glowing circle etched behind the windmill. Before he could return to the barn, another presence approached, the distant hum of a county truck rolling slowly down the dirt road. Dust billowed behind it in a lazy plume. He recognized the vehicle before he recognized the man, Deputy Callahan, a good OL boy type with a mustache that did most of the talking for him. The truck slowed near the driveway. Callahan leaned out the window, friendly enough but wearing the expression of someone sniffing around a story. He mentioned the storm, how half the county lost power. Then he said casually, too casually, that a couple folks reported strange lights toward this direction. Probably nothing. Probably atmospheric. Probably kids flying drones. But he had to check in just to be sure. Hank forced a steady tone, nodding, smiling, saying he didn't see anything unusual. The deputy looked past him toward the barn for a heartbeat too long. The silence that followed felt heavy, evaluative. Then Callahan tipped his hat and drove off, leaving Hank drowning in the implication. Eyes were on him now. Inside the barn, the being sensed everything: Hank's fear, the aircraft, the deputy, the crushing weight of deadlines. The creature's thoughts pressed faintly into Hank's mind like fingerprints on frosted glass. Certain agencies in the United States, the United Kingdom, and Canada had detected disruptions during the storm, energy signatures impossible to ignore. Hank wasn't the only one on a countdown. Something larger was ticking too. As daylight drained from the sky, he stepped out to lock the barn door. Across the desert, the state route shimmered under the night's first stars. A pair of headlights appeared on the distant stretch, slow, deliberate, unmarked. The vehicle paused on the shoulder. Another joined it minutes later. No county plates. No rancher silhouettes. Hank stood frozen in the doorway of his barn, the desert wind sliding cold against the back of his neck. The countdown clock had begun. Not just for his home. Not just for his land. For whatever, or whoever, he was hiding in the barn. The next move wasn't going to be his. And the unmarked vehicles waited in the dark like predators deciding when to close in. Dawn arrived with a sharpness that felt unnatural, as though the sun was rising faster than it should, urging Hank to move before the world caught up. The barn door creaked as he pushed it open. Inside, the ship glowed faintly, its systems humming with a new stability. The being waited, its presence steady, as if day 3 carried a significance Hank wasn't yet ready to confront. Today wasn't about observation, or visions, or revelations carved in glass. Today was about action. And consequences. The being's thoughts pressed into Hank's awareness with quiet force. Alignment must be practiced, not studied. If Hank wanted to keep the land, if he wanted any chance at survival in the face of foreclosure, government scrutiny, or the unraveling of his own faith, he had to choose a specific outcome and align every part of himself toward it. Mind, emotion, action. No contradiction. No panic. No fallback plans built on fear. The choice came easily, almost painfully so: the land. Losing it meant losing everything that remained of his father, his wife, his children's childhoods, and the man he used to be. Saving it wasn't just survival, it was identity, legacy, purpose. The being led him through the process, its thoughts guiding him toward a clarity he'd never achieved in prayer. Not begging. Not bargaining. Alignment. Hank was asked to feel the emotion of already having what he needed, to live the day as though the outcome had already resolved in his favor. It felt impossible. It felt like lying to himself. But the being held his mind steady, adjusting his focus each time fear intruded. Everything that happened next unfolded with eerie precision. The first event came mid-morning. Hank's phone rang, a number he didn't recognize. He almost ignored it, habit forged from months of debt collectors. But something nudged him to answer. The bank representative on the other end explained a previously unnoticed overpayment on an old account Hank had forgotten existed. A small amount, but credited back to him with no dispute. The timestamp on the automated receipt they sent? 3:33 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time. Hank's pulse quickened. Coincidence still sat rationally on the table. But coincidence was shifting, bending. Later, as he worked on the ship, a vibration shook the barn. Not from the craft, not from the earth, but from the tiny mail alert on his phone. An email from the county. Something about a clerical review. He opened it slowly, bracing for another blow. Instead, the message detailed a filing error in their system, a penalty added twice by mistake. The correction lowered his owed amount significantly. Not enough to save him outright, but enough to change the shape of the mountain he was climbing. The timestamp again, 3:33 p.m. local this time. His breath caught. Something inside him shifted. Not relief. Recognition. A feeling he hadn't let himself touch in years. By late afternoon, the air around the barn felt charged again. Not like the storm, but like possibility itself had thickened. The being guided him outside, toward the old mailbox at the edge of the road. The desert wind was warm, carrying dust and the faint smell of sage. Each step felt heavy, deliberate. Hank's mind raced with fear and hope braided so tightly together they became indistinguishable. He opened the mailbox. Inside lay a single envelope addressed in clean, official print. His hands trembled as he pulled it out. The return address belonged to a medical office he hadn't visited in months, a follow-up from tests he'd been too afraid to pursue, too tired to confront. He tore it open. The paper inside felt heavier than it should, as though carrying the full weight of his fate. When he read the words, the desert seemed to tilt beneath him. The news, unexpected, inexplicable, impossible under ordinary conditions, shifted everything. A correction, a reversal, a remission, a mistake caught in his favor. Stamped in the top right corner, the time the letter had been processed. 3:33. The desert wind stilled. The world narrowed to a point. His breath thickened in his throat. Alignment hadn't granted him a miracle. It had changed the pathways that led to one. It had rewired cause and effect like the circuits he'd been repairing in the ship. And as he stood at the mailbox gripping the letter with trembling fingers, he realized with dawning awe and rising dread that his life had just split cleanly in two. Before the law, and after it. The being waited in the barn for his reaction, but Hank couldn't move. The truth had arrived in his hands, stamped with the number that had followed him for years. The next step was no longer about belief. It was about admitting that something in him had awakened, and the world around him was already responding. The barn no longer held the feel of a workspace. It had become something closer to a sanctuary, or a launch pad, its air humming with an intelligence that bent space into stillness. The ship, now restored to a functional glow, pulsed with rhythmic light along its seams, each pulse resonating through Hank's chest like a second heartbeat. The being motioned, wordlessly, effortlessly, inviting him to step inside the craft for the first time. A threshold crossed by instinct rather than courage. Inside, the air felt unnaturally calm, as if insulated from every law the desert followed. The walls shimmered in shifting gradients, alive with flowing patterns that looked like mathematics turned into light. The being moved toward the front of the chamber, its presence radiating purpose. Hank felt pressure building, cosmic, ancient, unmistakable. Today was not about repair. Today was about revelation. The floor beneath him softened, then dissolved into a field of stars. Hank's breath hitched. He wasn't floating, yet gravity felt thinner, almost negotiable. Constellations he recognized, Orion, Cassiopeia, the familiar ridges of the Milky Way, appeared and disappeared in shifting overlays. Astronomical data streamed through the space. Orbital paths, magnetic signatures, gravitational waves, movements layered over movements until the sky itself felt like a breathing organism. Then came the visions. Not historical this time. Not memories. Patterns. Cycles. Cosmic rhythms intertwined with human consciousness. Hank saw star systems bending through epochs, solar alignments sweeping across millennia like slow-motion lightning. Every pattern folded into another, revealing an architecture that made history look like a clock with hidden gears. The being guided him through each layer with infinite patience, letting him feel the patterns rather than analyze them. Through the visions pulsed another thread, prophetic resonance. He felt scriptures he'd studied for decades, verses whispered in hospitals and read at funerals, lifting from their old meanings and standing beside these cosmic patterns like two halves of a torn map finally aligned. Where prophecy spoke of cycles, the galaxy spoke of motion. Where Jesus spoke of the kingdom within, the visions showed a field of consciousness unfolding like a sunrise. Then came the shift, the final layer. The cosmic map contracted inward. Trails of light curved into a single convergence point. Solar trajectories intersected with gravitational arcs. Human consciousness climbed in frequency. The being's thoughts sharpened, focusing Hank's attention on a specific alignment in the near future. Not far, not mythic, not symbolic. A real astronomical event. A real moment in time. The day of return. Hank's heart stopped for a beat. Then another. His knees weakened. The revelation didn't land like thunder. It landed like truth finally speaking its own name. Tears blurred the star fields beneath his feet. He wasn't seeing spectacle, trumpet blasts, or fire falling from the sky. None of the imagery that filled sermons and television prophecies. The being showed him something quieter and infinitely more terrifying. A deadline. A moment when consciousness, physics, and spiritual law would align so precisely that the world's inner state, not its outer rituals, would determine who recognized the arrival and who slept through it. The being's warning struck with surgical precision. The date wasn't about destruction. It wasn't about reward. It was alignment. And almost no one was ready. Humanity had buried the law Jesus embodied under doctrine, fear, entertainment, and noise. Hank saw millions praying from panic rather than coherence. Millions waiting for rescue rather than transformation. Millions believing they were prepared while carrying hearts tuned to frequencies that would not register his return at all. Grief tore through Hank with raw, animal force. Grief for wasted years. Grief for churches trying their best with broken instructions. Grief for a world sleepwalking toward a moment no one was teaching correctly. The being let him feel every ounce of it, not to crush him but to anchor him. Revelation without weight would be useless. Then came the final surge, a single image of the alignment itself. Just enough detail to burn it into him. Just vague enough to keep it sacred. He knew the day. He knew the conditions. And he knew the cost of spreading it carelessly. Truth this sharp could heal or shatter depending on who held it. When the vision collapsed, Hank stumbled backward, hands shaking violently. The chamber solidified beneath him. The desert heat rushed back in. His heartbeat pounded like it was trying to outrun the revelation now etched into his soul. He stepped out of the craft into blinding sunlight, gasping, the world around him suddenly too small to contain what he now carried. He knew the day of return. And with that knowledge came a responsibility he wasn't sure he could bear. Far across the desert, a distant engine growled to life. Something, or someone, was already closing in. The final evening settled over the property like a veil, thin, trembling, stretched tight between what Hank was and what he would become. The desert wind carried the faint smell of creosote and dust, rippling across brittle grass as if whispering warnings. The craft behind him hummed with rising power, its systems realigned and ready. Its departure was no longer theoretical. Time had run its course. But Hank's crisis wasn't inside the ship. It was inside his chest. The being had given him everything needed for alignment, visions, truth, the date itself, and now left a single unresolved question echoing through his mind. What will you do with it? The weight of that choice pressed harder than any foreclosure notice, harder than the unmarked vehicles creeping closer down the county road. Truth was heavy. Forbidden knowledge was heavier. If he stayed silent, he would protect his church, his neighbors, his children from a truth they might not survive. Silence would keep the world intact. Comfortable. Sleep. If he told his church, he risked becoming exactly what he feared. The crazy old man people whispered about at Picacho Cafe. His name would become a prayer chain rumor, his warnings reduced to anxious gossip. His revelation might be dismissed before it ever reached a heart ready to hear it. If he went public online, the government attention he already felt brushing his property would become suffocating. The agencies the being mentioned, US, UK, Canada, were already watching this region. Posting the date would paint a target on his back so large the desert wouldn't hide him. And truth distributed too quickly became noise instead of transformation. A fourth option emerged, a quiet one. Leave breadcrumbs. Coded warnings. Messages disguised as parables and patterns that only seekers would recognize. He could speak without shouting. He could guide without exposing. He could carry the law in a way that awakened the few who were ready and didn't crush the many who weren't. The being's thoughts brushed his mind one final time, soft, approving, distant. The choice would be his alone. The watchers did not command, compel, or interfere. Their work was observation. His work was decision. Outside, tires crunched on distant gravel. The unmarked vehicles rolled closer, slow, careful, patient. He knew what they were doing. Mapping. Measuring. Confirming the energy signatures that hadn't fully faded since the storm. The ship brightened behind him. A low vibration moved through the barn walls. Departure was imminent. He could feel the countdown like a tremor in his bones. Hank stepped out of the barn and onto the porch, the boards creaking under his boots. The sky stretched wide above him, painted with constellations so sharp they felt newly minted. The digital clock inside the trailer blinked through the window. 3:33 a.m. The exact time that had followed him for years. The time the being said marked moments of alignment. The time he had always mistaken for coincidence or torment. The ship's light ignited behind the barn, rising like a silent second sunrise in the wrong direction. The vehicles on the county road stopped altogether, headlights cutting across the desert like search beams. Hank stood in the crosswind, caught between revelation above and foreclosure below, between divine alignment and earthly threat. Then, with the weight of 2,000 years settling on his shoulders, he made his decision. Quiet. Absolute. Irreversible. The choice that would determine not just the future of his land, but the future of everyone who would one day hear his coded warnings. A faint pulse rippled across the sky, alien light receding into the stars. And somewhere beyond the mountains, in towns and farms and cities across North America, others were waking at 3:33 a.m. with the sense that someone, or something, had just whispered their names. Hank's story was only the first. The next echo had already begun.